Hey everyone, welcome back to the Read Report. I'm super stoked to be talking to you guys about the closing arguments in Karen Read's trial number 2. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the first 5 minutes of each side's closing argument, and then I'm going to get into what I thought was effective, what I thought maybe wasn't as effective, the different stylistic choices that each side used to present their closings in this second trial against Karen Read. So let's take a look first at Alan Jackson. He gave the argument for the defense, and then I will talk about whether or not I thought it was super effective.
There was no collision. There was no collision. There was no collision. I want to take a minute to start off with thanking you. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you for your patience. I want to thank you for your diligence. This is not an easy undertaking. Most of all, I want to thank you for your courage, because courage is what this moment demands. Not just to listen, but to stare directly at injustice and say, not here, not now, not on our watch. That's what you're being asked to do. Stare down injustice. I want to start with a simple truth. You folks, not us, nobody else in the courtroom, you folks are the last line of defense. The last line of defense between an innocent woman and a system that has tried to break her, that falsely accused her, that tried mightily to bury the truth. This case was corrupted from the start. It was corrupted by biases and conflicts and personal loyalties that you heard about. And most fatally, it was corrupted by a lead investigator whose misconduct infected every single part of this case from the top to the bottom. In our opening comments to you a few weeks ago, we told you what to watch for. We warned you what to watch for. We begged you what to watch for. Watch for the physical evidence. Pay attention to the medical facts. Pay attention to the science and the physics. But also pay attention to the integrity, the very essence, the integrity of the investigation. But you also saw something during the course of the trial that none of us might have expected, something that should sadden us, something that maybe would anger us. On full display, you saw the lengths to which some police officers will go to protect their own at the expense of the rest of us, at the expense of Karen Read, an innocent woman. Before we examine the evidence in the case, which we will do, we need to understand the very foundation of the entire system of justice in which we operate. It's the bedrock on which this entire system is built. Reasonable doubt. This isn't just a technicality, and it's not a slogan. It's a constitutional shield that protects the innocent and prevents the government from punishing without proof. The Commonwealth has the high burden to prove every single element of every single charge beyond a reasonable doubt and to a moral certainty. As I said, those powerful words are not just some legal jargon. They're your mandate, they're your obligation, they're your community's protection against injustice. In our system of justice, Karen Read sits here today presumed innocent, cloaked in the presumption of innocence. That presumption is not fragile. It doesn't just disappear because there's a charge or a badge or a theory. That presumption stands firm unless and until the Commonwealth clears that high bar, the highest bar the law provides, proof beyond a reasonable doubt and to a moral certainty. That means at the end of this case, at the end of the trial, you think about one or more of the charges, you think, you know what, maybe that's true. It might be true. Then you vote not guilty. If you think it's possibly true or probably true, your vote must be not guilty. If someone among you thinks it's likely true or even very likely to be true, your vote is not guilty. It's because none of those standards, maybe, might be, possibly, probably, likely, very likely, none of those meets the extraordinary burden of beyond a reasonable doubt and to a moral certainty. A moral certainty means a level of confidence so strong, so incredibly unshakable, that you could go home, you would go home, look your loved ones in the eye and say, I am certain. Not probably, not likely. I'm morally certain, and my certainty remains unshakable. The law defines moral certainty as the highest level of certainty known in all human affairs. Think about that. You must be that certain about the entirety, not part of, the entirety of the Commonwealth's case. As we discuss this case, you'll see that the Commonwealth comes nowhere near, nowhere close to reaching that extreme burden of proof.
So, I'm going to stop it right there. That's about the 5-minute mark. That's a flavor of what Alan Jackson, Karen Reed's defense attorney, delivered in this closing argument for the defense's side. Now, if you just look at that objectively, you'll note that the key point that the defense wants these jurors to take with them into the deliberation room. So let's say you're a juror on this panel, and I hope you don't tune out a lot of the rest of it, but if you did tune out a lot of the rest of it, that first 5 minutes is where they're jamming all these key points into their argument. If there is the slightest bit of doubt, you must not convict her. You must find her not guilty. Now, do I think this clip in and of itself is strong, excellent, airtight? It was well done. Yes. Do I think the entire defense's closing argument was overall very effective and it didn't have a few kinks in it? It did have a few kinks in it, okay? We'll talk about that. But I think just looking at that first 5 minutes of Alan Jackson appealing to these jurors, appealing to the actual standard, the burden of proof that the prosecution has to reach in this case, I think is incredibly effective. And if the jurors were to hear only the first 5 minutes where they're listening intently to this, then I do think that there's a chance that Karen Reed could get off scot-free. Now, when I say scot-free, does that mean they're not going to do anything when it comes to the operating under the influence charge, one of the lesser included? I still think there's a strong chance that she could wind up with something. But my hope is that given the burden of proof, given the failure of the lead investigator in this case, Michael Proctor, to conduct this investigation with the integrity that the state of Massachusetts, our criminal justice system, requires, does not close the door entirely to a not guilty verdict across the board. Now, do I also think that there were parts of Alan Jackson's argument that were not incredibly effective? I do. Do I not also think that if I were a juror on this case, I would take a little bit of an issue when it comes to some of the things that Alan Jackson said in his opening statement, that the evidence was going to show that the defense, quite honestly, never delivered on. They fell short in some ways. I do think so, because I think that they underestimated or they misinterpreted who they thought the Commonwealth would call as witnesses. Because if you'll recall, in his opening statement, Alan Jackson made a statement that there were going to be eyewitnesses proving, he said this, he told the jury this, that John O'Keefe was in the house that night, meaning he couldn't have been on the lawn where everybody says he was, because there was an eyewitness placing him in the house. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, oh, who would that have been? Because we didn't hear that throughout the case. You're correct. We did not hear anybody state for a fact John O'Keefe came in the house that night. It would, I think, presumably have been Brian Higgins, because if you'll recall at the last trial, Brian Higgins placed an unidentified male with some similar characteristics to John O'Keefe in the house that night. Brian Higgins at the last trial testified he didn't know who the man was, but he placed someone else there that nobody else placed there. Now, was that John O'Keefe? He must have known what John O'Keefe looked like, because he went out with him and knew of him, and certainly knew Karen. He had hung out with the two of them before. So I do think they fell short in some respects there, but obviously he didn't bring that up in the closing argument. I'm just putting myself in the juror's position. If I had watched both the opening and the closings, I would be thinking about maybe what they delivered on, what they didn't deliver on. And I do think that's one thing, because the Commonwealth never called Brian Higgins this time around. Then they weren't ever able to introduce the question of perhaps John O'Keefe did come in the house. What else do I think about this first 5 minutes and the rest of Alan Jackson's closing argument? I think first and foremost, he did a good job of stating that we have science on our side, we have engineering on our side, we have these experts stating flat out John did not get hit by a vehicle. On the other end of the coin, I do think that there was still a little bit too much focus given to the potential third-party culprit theory. I do think there was too much focus given to the dog bites, or alleged dog bites. I do think they got into the weeds a little bit too much with some of the other elements of the case. And something else that personally I just don't like, hopefully the jury won't take issue with, but when he says Karen Reed is an innocent woman. Well, if I'm a juror sitting there at this point, unfortunately, we do have, and Hank Brennan brings them up again, we have videos of Karen admitting to drinking that night. So not only last trial we had videos of her appearing to drink in the surveillance footage of the bars, but now we have Karen's own words, multiple video clips where she is discussing she was in fact inebriated that night. And she even questions, I probably wouldn't have gotten on the freeway. But so if he's coming out swinging away, she's an innocent woman, I mean, that might not sit well with every single one of the jurors. Just saying. Again, the Commonwealth does have that burden of proof. They have, to a degree, of moral certainty, the highest known degree of moral certainty known to man. So that's significant, right? I also think that Alan Jackson does a nice job of appealing to the jurors. First of all, he immediately thanks them within this first 5 minutes. He's thanking them, something I don't think Hank Brennan did at all in his closing argument. And he also is enlisting them. Hey, be the good guys here. You guys do the right thing, because the Commonwealth junked up this investigation so badly. We could all be Karen Reed. I think that that was effective, saying you guys are the last line of defense between the state and an innocent woman. Again, innocent, not sure. But I do think that was an effective persuasion method. Now, as I mentioned, the rest of Alan Jackson's argument, I think, at times got a little bit too into the weeds. He got a little bit too into Brian Higgins and Brian Albert squaring up in the bar that night. He shows video footage, might have even been the first clip that he showed, the first visual presentation that he showed in this closing argument was of the guys sparring in the bar. This, to me, is so weak. This is such weak evidence that a full fight ensued after that. These guys horseplaying in the bar. Sure, we know men, especially when they're drinking, sometimes like to roughhouse. And alcohol, while it can also fuel toxicity and it can fuel intense emotional reactions, I think it can also certainly fuel physical violence. But when they played that, I kind of cringed. I'm like, oh, come on. This can't really be the best that they've got. They could have focused more, in my opinion, on the poor police investigation. Now, he did mention Proctor in the first 5 minutes, and later in his argument, we do hear him reading Proctor's text messages. Now, that, I think, was highly effective, because in my mind, you cannot read those text messages enough. I personally did like it better when it was Proctor himself up there reading the text messages, because they were so vile, absolutely vile, that he was whispering some of them under his breath. He was not speaking clearly, intentionally, I think, at the last trial, because he was so embarrassed that the feds had these messages that were highly, highly, highly discriminatory and, frankly, misogynistic, mean, demeaning, and hateful towards the subject of his investigation, one of the suspects in his investigation. But there were no other suspects because of the putrid hate, the disdain that Michael Proctor held against Karen Read from the get-go. And Michael Proctor, might I remind you, which Alan Jackson does allude to, personal ties. Michael Proctor knew the Albert family. Michael Proctor knew some of the witnesses in this case that he was interviewing. He did not recuse himself. And he was not upfront about knowing these people. So in my mind, whatever happened that night, we're never going to fully know beyond a reasonable doubt to the highest degree of moral certainty, because this was not a fair investigation. They played Karen Read dirty. And that is the most compelling argument, I think. That there was a botched police investigation, a biased police investigation from the get-go. Miss Read was honed in on, and because of this, that's why we're sitting here today. We will never know the truth. It is a shame. There will be no real justice for John O'Keefe, a man who was loved by basically everyone. And that is a travesty. And can't lock this lady up. That's just my take. Haters, say what you want to say. But anyways, that's Alan Jackson. I do think overall it was incredibly effective. If you just take those first 5 minutes, you add on Proctor's text messages, which, by the way, at the last trial, because Michael Proctor was kind of uttering them under his breath, you wonder if the jury at the last trial made out all of the things that Michael Proctor had texted. And I'd have to ask, did you actually hear everything that was in these texts? Because they were harder to hear at the last trial when they were delivered, of course, by Michael Proctor, who had not yet been fired by the Massachusetts State Police. You have to wonder. So this time, the jury got them once already. They were already read by one of Proctor's friends. And they were read again in closing by Mr. Alan Jackson, which I think was a masterful choice. I also like how at one point he calls for courage. He tells the jury, this is a moment of great courage. And it almost made me think of that hockey guy, Herb, whatever his name is, the miracle speech. That was like, it's an opportunity. I don't know, something about it reminded me of like sports history and the USA team. Moments are born of great opportunity, and that's what we have here tonight, boys. That's what we've earned here tonight, boys. So maybe that'll work with a few of the jurors who maybe are sports-minded. We also know they made a lot of references to Arca's work for the NHL to sort of build rapport with the jury in that way. I think ultimately, if I were defending Karen Read, which I'm not a lawyer, this is not legal advice whatsoever. However, I do think that I would put more stock in the botched investigation bag. I do think that's a stronger case. I mean, they collected blood samples in red Solo cups, for God's sakes. They used a leaf blower. They hardly secured the crime scene. They had the Canton Police Department initially responding to the scene. The Canton Police Department, of course, they're going to have them respond because they were in Canton. But Kevin Albert, brother of the homeowner at 34 Fairview Road, is on the Canton Police Department. Brian Higgins, who was at the house that night, 34 Fairview Road, had an office at the Canton Police Department. He was not a Canton Police Department member. He worked for the ATF, but he had an office. He had special privileges at the Canton Police Department, and as we saw, he went to the Canton Police Department. He's on camera at the Canton Police Department that same night wearing a hoodie. And we have witnesses saying, oh, I think he was in the Sallyport with Ken Berkowitz, the former Canton Police Chief, for an extraordinarily long time. But that's a false memory. It's a false memory. It's an oddly specific false memory. And that witness was also working there that night. So yeah, I mean, I guess Higgins is sort of tied into that third-party culprit theory, but also I think he also ties into that notion of a botched bias investigation. because of his close personal ties and the close personal ties of the homeowners with the town of Canton. So that's Alan Jackson. I'm sure I'll have more to say, but that's overall my take with his closing argument. I'm sure I'll think of other things as we get into this, but let's take a look at Hank Brennan.
John O'Keefe was 46 years old. 46 years old. He spent his life helping people. He's described as a good man, kind, generous, thoughtful. He was a Boston police officer. He worked to help the community. Everything you've heard about this man, he was a good man. He helped people. When his niece and nephew had nobody, he took them in. He took them in. John O'Keefe seemed to be the type of person who would help anybody at any time. And on January 29th, 2022, John O'Keefe needed some help. He needed help from somebody else. You see, John O'Keefe had just been hit by Karen Reed in front of 34 Fairview Road, and he lay on the ground dying. And he needed help. Someone to reach out a hand, someone to knock on a door, someone to make a phone call to 911, even anonymously. Not take responsibility, just to help. And there was only one person in this entire planet who could help him that morning, to give him a chance. Maybe it was a 33% chance if he met the Isaac Wolf of the world, but to give him a chance. And that one person who could help him that morning was this defendant right here, Karen Reed. And she made a decision. In her Lexus with the shattered taillight, debris field all over the front yard, John O'Keefe lying helpless like a child in the front yard. She made a choice. She didn't call 911. She didn't run to his aid. She didn't knock on a door. She made a decision about herself. In her Lexus, she drove away. She was drunk. She hit him, and she left him to die. She was drunk. She hit him, and she left him to die. Before I go through and detail the evidence, let's talk a little bit about the evidence as a whole. She was drunk. She was drinking that night. She was drinking McCarthy's with John. She was drinking at the waterfall. Her blood was taken with samples of a retrograde analysis, almost 2 to 3 times the legal limit. She was drunk. She hit him. The timeline in this case is beyond dispute. You can accuse, assault, characterize, malign, twist. The timeline doesn't change. It is data. Data is data. The black box, the forensics from the SD card, we know exactly step by step where they were. We know in that window she hits him because he never moves again. His healthcare data, the temperature on the battery of the cell phone, the physical evidence, the debris field, the DNA, the hair. And then she left him to die. He had a basal skull fracture. Count the coop. You heard all about it when the back of your head hits the ground and the brain comes forward. Dr. Wolf told us the reason why they have level 1 trauma centers around the country is because people can survive this injury if they get help. That's why they have this care. That's why they have these hospitals. But you got to get help. You got to get help. And if you don't, you develop symptoms, ecchymosis, raccoon eyes, your brain swells, and you die. She was drunk. And that night was a recipe for disaster. But before we get to the drinking, in some ways, the fate of this night was sealed well before that night, because John O'Keefe and Karen Reed were in a toxic relationship. This relationship was crumbling. We hear lovey-dovey, and it was crumbling, and we know it. And we know it because a month before, his niece Kaylee talks about when they went to Aruba. It should have been a wonderful event. It was discord. It was fighting. It was aggravation. And when they got back, the discontent was palpable. Miss Reed reaches out to Brian Higgins, text messaging. John O'Keefe, the relationship is crumbling. And you heard a little bit about what that relationship was like. Kaylee, his niece, told you, when there was an argument, John would do what John does. He would walk away. She described to you one time, to get away from the scene, he walked into his bedroom. But the defendant wouldn't let it go, pounding on his door, having to get the last word, never letting go of the fight. Kind of mirrors what happens on January 29, 2022.
So I played 6 minutes instead of 5 for Hank Brennan's argument here. But it's a different argument entirely from Alan Jackson's, obviously, because they have very different theories of what happened that night. And also, it's a different style. We see Hank Brennan is not bound to that podium the same way Alan Jackson was. Now, Alan Jackson probably could have gotten up and moved around a little bit, but Hank Brennan is virtually off script. And you'll see him at times going over to reference his notes throughout this argument, but I do think that that is a little bit more effective if you're looking to connect with the jury on another level. And he did a similar thing in his opening statement. He's not afraid to walk around and to look at that jury, address that jury, and show the jury some of Karen Read's videos. We didn't see any of them here, but they are in the latter half of this closing. We see several times he pulls up some of Karen Read's own words, completely in flush, completely aligns with what we saw in opening statements and what we've seen trickled in by Hank Brennan throughout this trial. I think personally this would have been an entirely different case had we not had those videos of Karen Read talking about how much she had to drink that night, talking about how she wondered, could I have hit him? Talking about going to the scene that morning, making fun of Peggy O'Keefe, who, by the way, during Hank's arguments here, we see Peggy O'Keefe crying right there. We see the woman to her left attempting to console her during this. And Hank, in his first minute, is talking not about the elements of the case. He's talking about John O'Keefe as a person. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. In my mind, this is a cheap win. Hank, as much as he loves to say he has the data is disputed by many of the defense's experts. Some, which we heard in Alan Jackson's closing, of the Commonwealth's own experts have said we cannot reach a full conclusion because there is not enough evidence. So, Hank, as much as I'd love to believe you that you have this data, not all of it is pure, and all of it ultimately can be sourced back to the cancer of this case, the cancer that is Michael Proctor, lead investigator, ex-Massachusetts state policeman, sending these horrible, disparaging text messages about Karen Read to his friends, something he never thought was going to come to light, but has been read multiple times in open court. So, Hank, while I do love to hear about your data, that, my friend, is highly contested. And I do think there's an emotional, sensational grab here. And that's not to say the other side hasn't played that card as well. That's not to say the other side isn't playing this, oh, poor Karen card, because they certainly are, right? But at this point, I think Hank knows that a lot of his case, the defense was sticking a needle in those balloons. You know what I mean? You can see, in my opinion, that Hank's confidence throughout this trial has dwindled a little bit. At the beginning, he comes across incredibly polished, incredibly buttoned up, incredibly professional, sticking to the facts. And then, as the defense brings in their experts, some of their experts who are highly, highly qualified, they have PhDs, they study in unique fields, they've helped the Department of Justice, they've helped the NHS, and then you have Shannon Burgess, one of the Commonwealth's expert witnesses, who, by the way, this data does ultimately source back to him when we're speaking about the cell phone data, when we're speaking about the text stream data. A lot of this ties back to another, I won't say cancer, he seems like a very nice guy, but another incredibly problematic witness for the Commonwealth, an expert who has fewer degrees than I do, and I only have my bachelor's. But anyways, I do find that this might very well resonate with a lot of the jury. Unfortunately, I think that the type of society that we live in is going to have a hard time reconciling Karen Read's own words. I am hopeful that the jurors will really be looking into the elements of this case that are contestable, the elements of this case that leave them with a question in their minds. I'm hopeful that they will take this responsibility seriously and they will realize they're taking away someone's liberty with this, potentially. And At the same time, Hank has these very devastating videos in my mind, because Karen, as much as I'd love to say, you go girl, speak your truth, do your thing, you think that they're framing you, whatever it is. Maybe she doesn't actually think that. Maybe she knows that she did it, but she puts on this facade. But nonetheless, her giving these interviews, if we had this case with none of these interviews introduced, I do think there is a much stronger chance she would be walking scot-free. But unfortunately, we live in an inherently misogynistic society. And people are not going to like a woman who comes out to bat and says, take me down, come at me, Commonwealth. They're going to be intimidated by that, perhaps, or they're going to hate it. So I think that in the end, if she comes back guilty of anything, the videos are going to be the sinker. And Karen, I wish you didn't do it, but I understand. I think she thought she was going to be acquitted. And that's why she gave all these interviews. Now we know since then she's still been giving interviews, so maybe that's not entirely why she said yes to all these media interviews, but if you're her attorneys, you must be like, oh, you're just sad every time one of them is played. You're just like, oh man. So, as I mentioned, he brings up the clip. One of them during the closing arguments is Karen Reed talking about how much she had to drink that night. Again, not great, not great. And I think people are going to have a hard time letting her off completely scot-free when she's admitted, in her own words, to drinking that night. Now, sure, the testing wasn't done until hours later, and there is some wiggle room. Maybe she had drinks when she got back to the house. You never know. You never know. I do think this picture that they've painted, the Commonwealth has painted of Karen Reed throughout this entire case, by incorporating her own words, her own voice, her own videos, making fun of John O'Keefe's mom. I don't like it. I think they're a problem. I do think they're a problem. And I do think if any of the jurors want to come talk afterwards, if there are any of them who thought or think that she is guilty of something, I bet you anything they're going to point to those clips. They're not supposed to use that as the end-all be-all. They're not supposed to say that that is proof, but it points to state of mind. It points to potentially character. And that's rough. That's a hard pill to swallow. And I think Karen Reed knows that. But it's just unfortunate because I think it could have been an entirely different case this time around if they didn't have those. But anyways, enough about how misogynistic today's world is. Let's get back into Hank here. Now, Hank, I do think, me, myself, I just can't stand the guy. Anytime he talks, his overconfidence throughout the beginning of this trial and how he's treated some of the witnesses in this case, his own bias has shown. His own willingness to question. And, by the way, he brings up memory issues again in this closing argument. Really, Hank? Does that make you feel like a big, strong man? When you make fun of an old woman who's a freaking doctor, does that make you feel strong? Because, to me, the guy is a complete piece of work. I cannot stand him. I want to give him a wedgie. I just detest him. I hate to say it. But anyways, he certainly has a chip on his shoulder. He certainly feels some type of way about the O'Keefe family. He's met with them multiple times. He wants to deliver, and he is not backing down despite the defense's expert witnesses stating that actually John O'Keefe wasn't hit by a car. Despite them being pretty successful, in my opinion, of poking holes in his case. The defense's case presented an entirely different view of what potentially could have happened in my mind that night. And yet, here's Hank. He's not just saying, okay, we know she was drinking. We think it's pretty likely that this happened. He freaking wants all those charges. He wants Karen Reed to be found guilty across the board. He's not backing down because he wants to win. He's playing to win. And at what cost, Hank Brennan? At what cost does it make you feel like a big guy to point at Karen Reed? Does it make you feel like a big guy when you're making all these sound effects in front of the jury? Does it make you feel like a big guy when you're questioning Dr. Marie Russell whether she has memory loss? Why are they so hell-bent on getting her? I know the media uproar and the perception of this case by a lot of the public that's been unfavorable to some of the witnesses, unfairly favorable to some of the witnesses, is wrong. It's wrong. And Karen Reed, in my mind, there's no way, and even in your closing argument, Hank Brennan, you say, I'm never going to prove that she meant to do it. I'm never going to prove that this was premeditated. He doesn't have to with the charges, right? But I don't even know if you have anything that points to her knowing what happened, which is required for that leaving the scene charge. And also, I think she was so drunk, she had no idea what happened. Clearly, the woman's been without her license for 2.5 years, 3 years. I don't even know how long it's been at this point. She's gone almost bankrupt in legal fees. She is bankrupt, basically. And then her parents, who they're elderly folks, they're there at every hearing. They just want to retire. They want to enjoy retirement, okay? And they're also paying into her legal fees. And I get it. She made that choice that night to get in the car. She made that choice that night to drive when even she'll tell you she had drinks, several of them. But when are we all just gonna throw in the freaking towel? Come on, you guys. If this is another hung jury, I swear, the O'Keefe family will want to retry her. I think. I mean, it's gonna take one of them having to be critically ill or, dying before they're ready to give up because of the hatred they have for her at this point. And I know it's easy for me to say. They didn't kill anybody from my family, but just all agree that Michael Proctor ruined this for everyone. Let's move on. Let's stop funding these ridiculous trials. Let's just move the heck on with it. And then I do think there were some other points that Hank Brennan made that just didn't land well with me. Hank Brennan, for example, tries to defend certain people who are the Commonwealth's witnesses, who I don't think really, if I were a juror just looking at this case, I'd be able to say, oh yeah, I get why he says that about Jennifer McCabe. Like, he's defending Jennifer McCabe as this soccer mom who was trying to help Karen Reed, and she was trying to help her not incriminate herself, which, yes, she was. And she's also not the perfect witness, and I don't feel like you trying to make her some kind of saint in this is really gonna land the way you think it is, Hank. I also think the same thing about when you mentioned Trooper Buchanan, Sergeant Yuri Buchanan, who we saw in this trial testify. He was the person, the detective who was on the case with Michael Proctor from the beginning. He was also on one of the text chains, or a few of the text chains, with Michael Proctor, in which Buchanan, mind you, is a supervisor. He's an elder in this dynamic, okay? And we see that he does not reprimand Michael Proctor for his conduct in this initially. He likes some of his messages, being like, yeah, I support that. And Hank Brennan, in his closing, all to say, he says, Buchanan, something to the effect of, oh, he's a man of service. He's a man of integrity. He's a man of honor. Because of one of the questions that was asked to Trooper Buchanan about whether he thinks that Michael Proctor conducted this investigation with integrity and honor. And I believe he either said yes to honor and no to integrity, or yes to integrity, and no to honor is what he said. But that also doesn't track with me. Really? We're gonna defend Buchanan here? And he's like, yeah, Buchanan, oh, that's a man of integrity right there. He's not telling you that this case was honorably done. No, Buchanan also has his dirty foot in the pot, as far as I'm concerned. Just because he gave in to one thing, but said no, it was still an investigation with integrity, which, in my opinion, there's no way it was. Then what are you doing defending this guy? What are you doing defending Jennifer McCabe, who, by the way, clearly has lied on the stand before? What are you doing, Hank? That would be falling way short to me. And yes, Jennifer McCabe, as we know, did come across a little bit more palatable during this trial. But still, you can't just paint this beautiful picture of her. I don't think that's going to land. So, Hank Brennan overall, he's appealing to logic. He is appealing to the emotion. He's saying, Come on, doesn't this family deserve justice? Doesn't this deserve justice, guys? He's trying to minimize the effect that Michael Proctor, lead investigator, had on this case. He's trying to minimize some of the discrepancies. He's trying to minimize Shannon Burgess's misrepresentation of his academic credentials. And he's falling short, in my mind. He's completely falling short. But what will the jury think? I don't know. I do think Hank has put on one hell of a case. It is a difficult case to try. I don't like the guy. I don't agree with the guy. I don't appreciate how badly he wants to put Karen Reed away for a shoddy investigation at best. But he has been incredibly more effective than Adam Lally, the first lawyer, who is still in court for this trial. He's still been helping the prosecution with this case because he does know the case extraordinarily well. He's not the orator that Hank Brennan is. He doesn't have the years of legal expertise that Hank Brennan does. He doesn't have the defense background, which we see in Hank Brennan's questioning of the defense's experts in this case. Hank Brennan is putting on his defense attorney hat 100%. He's poking holes in the defense's experts by saying, is it possible that this isn't how it happened? Is it possible this? Is it possible that? So yes, maybe some will see that as he's definitely making a case against himself for reasonable doubt. If he says what happened isn't actually what happened, if Judge Welcher says what happened with John O'Keefe being hit in the arm, getting those wounds on his arm from the taillight isn't what actually happened, yes, those are holes in his own case. And he's also doing this strategically. He's pivoting. He's saying, oh crap, well, if they're going to say this, then I have to come up with something reasonable. And I want to just plant those little seeds in the jurors' minds. I want to plant the seeds of, okay, well, maybe not everything is entirely airtight. And if you take all the evidence in this case, if you take all the little pieces in the timeline, he does an excellent job at highlighting the timeline, then the simplest explanation, I think, is that she probably did hit him. That's what Hank Brennan is saying. And I do think that's effective. And I think if he does succeed in this case, and he does get some convictions here, a lot of lawyers, a lot of prosecutors are going to point to this case, and they're going to reference some of Hank Brennan's arguments, the way in which he pivots. People say, who are lawyers, a trial is a living, breathing thing. Sometimes you have to adapt. Sometimes you have to be flexible. And I do think Hank Brennan did an excellent job at that. He's clearly a masterful prosecutor. Don't like him. If I were a juror, I could not stand him. He's overconfident, he's cocky, and he's just got that nasally voice. So we'll see what happens, folks. Do I have predictions? I'll be wrong with anything that I try to put out here. And I think it's probably either going to be another mistrial and or not guilty across the board or guilty across the board. I kind of think it's going to be all or nothing with this. I'd love to be wrong. Maybe they hit her with just one simple manslaughter while OUI. Maybe they hit her with operating under the influence, that sort of thing. I don't know. I'm hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. But I'm going to be pretty fired up if she is found not guilty on all charges. I will be stoked out of my mind. What do you guys think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like, comment, share this video. And please, as always, follow the Read Report and make sure you are keeping up to date. We will be following the verdict closely and hopefully delivering more commentary. Have a fabulous rest of your weekend, and we look forward to seeing what happens